The ego has been a very controversial topic throughout time due to its different meanings. Some portray it as our greatest enemy, saying that ego is the root of our suffering. Others see it as the spark that drives us to create, to compete, and to win. But what is ego really? Is it a shadow we must destroy, or a force we shall embrace? Well, to answer this question, we need to look deeper into the meaning of ego, because ego doesn't have just one definition. Philosophers, psychologists, and even religions have all tried to explain it in their own ways, and the surprising thing is they all seem to hold a piece of the truth. So today we're going to explore those visions through the lens of two worlds that portrayed ego in a unique and detailed way: Blue Lock and Jujutsu Kaisen. These aren't just stories of matches that decide the future or battles that brush against death. They are mirrors of the complexity of what ego can really mean. To make it clear, the meanings of ego presented here are not official definitions but interpretations of these ideas. Also, spoiler alert for both the Blue Lock and Jujutsu Kaisen manga. And please give a like and subscribe. Let's start with one of the most famous ideas of ego described by Sigmund Freud. For him, the ego was meant to mediate between our inner desires and external reality. But if that balance breaks, ego turns into a burden instead of a guide. Rin Itoshi is a perfect example. His talent is undeniable, but his entire life revolves around surpassing his brother, Sai. That obsession makes him incapable of enjoying himself or even recognizing who he is outside of that rivalry. And that's exactly the trap Freud warned about. When ego is hijacked by impulses, it stops shaping the self and starts destroying it from within. But if we step away from psychology and move toward spirituality, Buddhism sees ego as attachment, the idea that our identity clings to something external, something we will inevitably lose. Sukuna embodies this vision. His ego depends entirely on being the strongest. Everything in him, his status, his power, his absolute identity, is built on that claim. While he dominates, he looks untouchable, but the moment that strength is questioned, his entire being trembles. Attachment makes him a prisoner. He can be anything other than the strongest, and that rigidity is what chains him, because the day that title is taken away, his entire self collapses with it. And then there's Alfred Adler, who saw the inflated ego as a mask of superiority created to hide a deeper wound of inferiority. Barrow reflects this perfectly. He doesn't wait for people to crown him a genius. He proclaims himself the king. The way he walks, the way he plays, the way he looks at others, everything screams authority. But others will say his ego isn't as solid as it seems, because Barrow isn't a strategist like Isagi, nor a natural prodigy like Rin. His strength comes from the role of king that he forced himself to play. That role makes him terrifying, but it also traps him. The moment someone breaks that narrative, his entire world shakes. As Adler explained, the superiority complex doesn't set you free. It enslaves you to the image you invented, and Barrow is chained to his own crown every time he's threatened. The interesting thing is when we look at these three approaches, Freud, Buddhism, and Adler, we find a key contradiction. Ego as an enemy doesn't always destroy immediately. Sometimes it even gives you strength, direction, and the illusion of invisibility. But that strength is borrowed, and sooner or later, the mask cracks. But of course, if ego were only an enemy, the logical step will be to eliminate it. But Nietzsche talked the opposite. For him, Ego was the will to power, the force that drives us to grow and to overcome ourselves. Gojo is the embodiment of this idea. His ego isn't humility or moderation. It's the absolute affirmation that he is the strongest. Many call it arrogance, but that conviction is what sustains him, because without that inner sincerity, his power wouldn't have the same presence and wouldn't inspire the same confidence in himself or in others. For Nietzsche, the will to power was just about dominating. It was about affirming oneself in full greatness. And that's exactly what Gojo lives by. His ego doesn't limit him, it elevates him, because without that conviction, his legend wouldn't exist. Carl Jung, on the other hand, saw ego as a mask, the face we show to the world in order to survive, but one that can last forever. Sooner or later, he said we must integrate our shadow. In other words, accept the parts of ourselves we deny. Kaiser is a clear example. His ego wears the mask of emperor, but behind that facade lies the wound of a child abused by his father and abandoned by his mother. A child who learned that the only way to escape was by creating a mask of perfection. Every brilliant play wasn't just talent, it was a desperate scream from someone who refused to feel humiliated ever again. But eventually, the mask is not enough. When he feels that all inferiority returns, Kaiser has to choose between run away again or embrace his shadow. And the moment he chooses to face his wound, he's reborn, because only someone who accepts their darkness can turn it into art. And Kaiser does exactly that. He transforms his shadow into impossible place, redefining who he is on the field. In contrast, the Stoics didn't see ego as expansion, but as discipline. The self wasn't meant to inflate, but to remain steady. Nanami embodies this vision. He doesn't aim to be the strongest or the most admired. His identity is forged in routine, in duty, and in the calm of choosing what's right, even when it hurts. His ego doesn't shout, "I am." It whispers, "I choose." And that's his strength. It doesn't depend on applause or titles, but on his inner conviction, which makes him unbreakable. And finally, another perspective from Adler, this time his more positive side. Ego as a motor for growth. Shiniri is living proof of this concept. His fear of injury kept him chained, a prisoner of himself. But in the decisive moment, his ego didn't lock him up. It set him free. He chose to run, even if it meant breaking. And that decision transformed him. He was no longer the player running from weakness, but the one embracing his destiny to overcome it. Adler explained it in this way. Ego can be born from a wound, but if it's directed toward growth, it becomes your greatest source of strength. After seeing so many perspectives, the inevitable question is ego good or bad? Well, the answer isn't that simple, because as we've seen, ego can be a mask that traps us, but also the spark that pushes us to grow. So the best answer to this question comes from two characters who embody the definition of identity, and as a result, the definition of ego. Yuji and Isagi. Yuji Itadori begins his journey believing he has no right to an ego on his own. He lives only to save everyone, following his grandfather's words as if that were his sole purpose. But that way of living breaks him because it doesn't come from within, it comes from an external demand. And the true breaking point arrives with Mahito. When Mahito tells him this,
"How can you do this? How can you play with so many people's lives and keep doing it over and over again?" Would you rather I just counted each one off my fingers with a look of regret? I'll be sure to do that the next time I kill somebody. Yuji Itadori. You are me, get it? Until you're willing to accept that fact, you'll never really be able to beat me.
Yuji tries to deny it, but little by little he understands it's true. They are the same at their core. Mahito kills human without hesitation, and Yuji kills curses without hesitation. Both follow their nature without question. That revelation is brutal because it shows Yuji he isn't a pure hero, but someone who also carries darkness and violence. But what changes in Yuji isn't denying that truth, but accepting it. Yes, he shares the same root as Mahito, the impulse to act without thinking twice. But what separates them is choice. That acceptance frees him, because now he doesn't live for an external mandate. He lives for his own purpose, to fight for people out of his own will. Here, humanistic psychology fits perfectly. The meaning of life doesn't come from denying who you are, but from deciding who you want to become. Yuji stops running from his ego and turns it into the compass that guides him down an authentic path. Isagi, on the other hand, finds his ego in a very different way. He doesn't start out trusting his ego. On the contrary, his idea of soccer was built on all for one. In other words, on disappearing into teamwork. But that mindset shatters when he hears Jinpachi Eagle's philosophy. A true striker doesn't play for the team. He leads the team by chasing his own goal. That's when his instinct awakens. He feels almost unconsciously the desire to pursue his own purpose, and that impulse launches him on a journey of discovery when he begins to identify his true weapon. The shot that turns zero into one.
But I found the thing that will let me survive at Blue Lock. The thing I've been looking for. The final piece. It's not enough to simply see the future. I have to keep them from catching up to it. With this! My direct shot! Found it. My formula for scoring. Yeah!
And with every match, he refines his ego, first through adaptability, then through metavision, until he reaches a point where he no longer plays from fear or emotion, but from absolute clarity of who he is and what he seeks. In Isagi, we see what Maslow described as self-actualization, the deep desire to discover one's own potential. His ego doesn't stagnate or overflow. It transforms, expands, and adapts. And in that process, he stops competing against others and begins competing against himself, against every past version of who he was. Isagi is, in a sense, ego evolving, not an enemy that chains him, not a mask that breaks, but a motor that forces him to grow. What's fascinating is that while Yuji represents reconciliations with ego learning that it's not wrong to have a self, Isagi represents the evolution of ego as a motor for growth. They are a living proof of what neuroscience suggests. The self is in a fixed essence, but a process in constant change, a network rebuilt with every experience. And this is where positive psychology fits too. Ego doesn't have to be a demon or a god. It can be a tool, a bridge between who we are and who we want to become. Yuji teaches us that denying ego is dying while alive, and Isagi teaches us that embracing it and letting it evolve is how you find your identity. So with all this in mind, we arrive at the final conclusion about the meaning of ego. Ego is not an absolute enemy, not an absolute ally. Ego is both. It can be the mask that drowns us or the force that lifts us. It can be the Rin's pride and Sakura's attachment, or Gojo's creative will and Nami's discipline and Shigeru's drive to overcome. But if there one lesson Isekai Yuji teaches us, is this. Ego is not something to destroy or worship. It's something to transform. Because in the end, the true power of ego depends on whether you choose to live as a slave to your mask or as the architect of your own evolution. Because ultimately, the question isn't whether ego is good or bad. The real question is, who are you with your ego?